Hello, everyone. It's Dr. Rebecca Branstetter, and with me, as always, is coffee. I mean, a new guest. This is Lauren Parker. Lauren, do you have any coffee with you?
I do.
Oh, and we all have learned that Lauren is a Capricorn. Delightful. And in case you didn't know, this is coffee. We're here for another episode of Coffee Break School Psychology, which is, kind of brewing up ideas, just 10, 15 minutes at a time, giving you sort of these practical nuggets about things that school psychologists come in contact with a lot, but sometimes teachers and parents and others don't have a ton of experience. And I will say on today's topic on how to support gifted students, I actually didn't learn a lot about gifted students in my school psychology program. We talked about disabilities, but we kind of touched on it, but very briefly. So, as we kick off, I just want, first off, Lauren, please introduce yourself and let me know why are you so interested in sharing about gifted students to the world?
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm a school psychologist in Central Florida. I work in public schools as well as private practice. My private practice is Central Florida Gifted Center. I work to really support gifted students, their families, help identify some of their social, emotional, and academic needs. I really got interested in gifted because, like you, we don't really learn a lot about it in grad school. We learn how to identify it, especially for those of us in states where it requires a cognitive score for eligibility. But after that, we don't really talk a lot about those students. However, in my practice, I noticed a lot of the students that we met who were having some mental health issues, who were struggling, especially at the secondary level with academic failure. These were a lot of our gifted students. And so, gifted teachers have great skills to help support students, and sometimes they need a little bit more. And I was fortunate enough to work with a great gifted teacher who really reached out to me for support. And we built like this collaborative relationship where we got to support the students in her classroom. I got to help support families when she felt like students need a little bit more. And that really got me interested in this population. You know, we do a lot to support our students who are falling kind of 2 standard deviations below the mean and need a lot of academic support. But I felt like we were kind of forgetting those students who fall 2 standard deviations above the mean, right? And so that's kind of where I got into gifted and have really enjoyed this work ever since.
Yeah, I've worked with a number of gifted students, and I just find that population to be so interesting and fascinating. And I think, we need to even just pedal back a little bit. Like, what is gifted? Like, what does that mean? I mean, we have, a lot of things out there about like, oh, multiple intelligence, everyone's gifted in their own way and things like that. But like, what is like the like, sort of industry standard definition of giftedness as it plays out in schools?
So educational giftedness is kind of different, right? And I almost wish we called it something else because you're right. Like all children have their own gifts, the things that they're good at, the things they enjoy. When we talk about giftedness in an educational space, we're really talking about students who are thinking, reasoning, problem solving well above what's expected for their age. And sometimes in classrooms, this means asking really abstract questions, asking kind of off the wall questions or giving off the wall answers that aren't what you're expecting, but they're right. Um, so, really, in an academic setting or an educational setting, we're looking at those students who have these really high levels of creativity, understanding of what's going on in the world around them, kind of beyond what we would expect for other students their age. And it's pretty cool to watch and see.
It really is. I see some of these students in like what it's referred to often as like brain utopia. Like they just go so deep into something and they just know more than me on it and they just come up with these like crazy interesting connections in class. Um, something I've also noticed though is sometimes I expect kids who are gifted to be good at everything. And there's some things that are sort of surprisingly not um, as developed. Can you tell me a little bit like what are some misconceptions? Is that a misconception that gifted kids are good at everything and it comes easy to them?
100%. So oftentimes when teachers are referring students for gifted or parents are asking like, could my child be gifted? a lot of times what they're observing is academic excellence. So kids who are really good at learning. And yes, there's a lot of overlap between students who have that high problem solving, reasoning, understanding, and being able to grasp those academic concepts. However, we also have what's called asynchronous development. And this is a very common thing in the gifted world is some students are really gifted in one area or a couple of areas, but may struggle in others. And we really see this the most in our younger students when they're problem solving, reasoning, planning, learning at those high levels, but then like social and emotionally, maybe they're a little bit immature or they're developed exactly where they should be for their age, but because everything else is a little bit higher, it looks weird. Like it's a little bit of a gap there. And you're like, but they understand these big concepts. Why can't they understand what they're feeling? Well, because that part hasn't developed yet. We also, I think one of the misconceptions I see a lot for little kids is definitely they're reading at a very high level, they must be gifted. And that's not necessarily true. So I know there's a lot of families where they see their child starting to learn to read. They're reading at a first or second grade level in kindergarten, and they're like, wow, they must really be gifted. And what's really cool is like their brain has picked up reading and just run with it. And it's really great. But some of those other gifted traits just aren't there yet. And so some of those misconceptions, I think there's a lot of misconceptions that all gifted kids are weird, right? I've heard people say, like, I'd rather my kid not be gifted because I'd rather them be normal. Well, not all gifted kids are weird, whatever that means. We do see neuroatypicality. So we see students who are gifted and maybe have other co-occurring conditions. So things like gifted in ADHD, we see gifted in autism. You can be gifted and have a learning disability. We call that twice exceptional. So there's just so much to giftedness beyond just you're really smart, which I feel like is really what society thinks about gifted is they're just really smart kids. And there's just so much more to it than that.
So it sounds to me like if you've met one gifted kid, you have met one gifted kid. Like it sounds like it's a really interesting group of students who have these skills, and some will have, what's splinter skills, like they have amazing, incredible conceptual knowledge or ability to do mathematics or read, and then surprisingly lower skills in other areas. And I'm glad you brought up twice exceptional. I sometimes hear this called 2E. Can you just like touch a little bit on that? Like if I'm a parent or a teacher out there, I'm like, okay, that sounds like the student or kid I have, like they're really, really like incredible at some things and just like really like surprisingly not in others. Like, what's that about?
So twice exceptional just means that a student can be gifted, but also have a learning disability of some kind, or some other disability. And it's not uncommon because the parts of our brain that do the thinking and problem solving and reasoning are not necessarily the same parts of our brain that do reading and math. And so students can have dyscalculia, dyslexia, dysgraphia, and still be gifted. So what I really take from that is one, learning disabilities doesn't tell us what you are capable of, just how you need support to learn. Um, and giftedness doesn't tell us that everything comes easy. It just tells us that there are some things that you are really, really good at. And so, really, when I work with gifted students, I try to find what their giftedness is, what their support needs are, and go from there.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what would you say is one of the top needs? Of course, we're broad brushing here, but you could probably detect some patterns in students who have giftedness. And you mentioned earlier, like providing support. So, maybe they don't need as much academic support. Maybe they need a different kind of support. Can you talk to me a little bit about the maybe top challenges that you see with students who have giftedness that might show up in the classroom or at home?
So one of the biggest I see is mental health, right? We see that with all of our students. I mean, we are seeing an influx of mental health needs across the board. What we know about gifted students is they often have a higher sensitivity to what's going on around them. They are more observant to the world around them, and that can be really difficult when the world around them doesn't make sense to them, or there's stress or conflict, and so they don't necessarily have the mental health skills, like the coping skills, to manage what they're experiencing with that heightened sensitivity. We also know that gifted students are more likely to internalize their academic successes and failures. As whereas other students will make it more about, I haven't learned this or this topic is hard. Gifted students will often internalize it to, I'm stupid. I don't understand this because I'm not as smart as everybody thinks I am. Which leads to imposter syndrome. We see a lot of perfectionism. If it's not perfect, it's not good enough. So really supporting those mental health needs as well as the social needs. There's a lot of different ways that schools support giftedness. And we see that if students don't get the support they need, we can see academic failure. They may start to mask some of that neuroatypicality or their own, for lack of a better word, nerdiness. They may start to mask that to fit in. And I feel like for me, that means they're not necessarily getting to tap into their own potential. So, really being able to support some of those more social, emotional, and mental health needs, I think, is essential in the gifted world.
Yeah, it's so interesting how it's connected because it's almost like they're turning their critical thinking skills and their attuned observational skills against themselves. Like they're acutely aware of everything going on. And, some of these students are like really aware of like, say, political or, world events, and they like take it in as if they are experiencing like super sensitive to these events because they can understand like all these long-term consequences of this thing that they're seeing in the news. The social needs, I mean, what I see sometimes, I don't know if you see this with some gifted students, is they gravitate towards adults because adults can like have a intellectual conversation, whereas like some other peers are talking about boogers and they're like, no, I want to talk about physics. And so it's kind of hard to relate to kids their own age. Like, is that something that you see, and how do we support kids who are turning their critical thinking skills against themselves or aren't connecting to their peers because they're just interested in stuff like way different?
I think first we have to find their social environment, right? And sometimes that for us as parents means getting out of our comfort zone to help them find it. You're right. They want to talk about the things that are interesting to them. And I have found, as the parent of gifted children, as somebody who supports gifted children, you sometimes have to give them more of an explanation than you think they need because they need to know. They have a need to know and understand. And so you can't just say, well, do it because I said so, right? Like you have to give them the reasoning behind it. And even when I'm working with students to support their social and emotional needs, I have to be really explicit and clear about what it is this coping skill is going to help them do. Why does their brain make them feel like they're in fight or flight when really they're just trying to finish a paper, right? Giving them almost like the scientific understanding rather than just saying, well, your body feels uncomfortable and taking deep breaths will help it make feel comfortable. Well, why does it feel uncomfortable? Why is the deep breath working? So sometimes we have, as adults, have to go a little bit deeper to have those conversations. But I really think finding the social skills, finding the things that they're good at, where they excel, and making sure they have lots of opportunity to engage in those activities is really, really important.
I heard it described once in a book I read called Rage to Learn. Like they
Mm.
have to know immediately why. They have to, and in a classroom setting, and sometimes as a parent, when you're trying to get in a car or whatever, like it can be really disruptive for the environment. Like, but why? And like, I disagree, and let's talk about it, and let's explain it, and let's go deep and take a deep dive. And really, it's something that most kids will be like, oh, I accept that as a thing and I move on. But this rage to learn is one of the deepest strengths, which is like, I gotta know, I gotta close the loop. But it can also be really disruptive. So, do you have any strategies for when kids get into that space where they're just dig in? I call it like sort of my way or the highway thinking, like, no, we have to do it this way. It's far superior to your way, or they can kind of dig in on things. And this isn't gifted kids, this is for all kids. So any practical things you do when kids get into that space where they have that rage to learn and need to know the why and you don't have time to explain it?
So there's actually a phrase I taught my kids. This is just like a general parenting thing because it would drive me crazy. But I also want my kids to have that rage to learn. I want them to understand the why. I don't want them to just accept what's out in the world at face value, right? And that's hard as a parent because you also want them to get in the car. So I use the phrase, yes, mommy, but why? So acknowledge that you are going to do this thing, and then I will tell you the why while we're on our way to the car, right? So yes, mommy, but why? And I think in a classroom that is yes, I understand, and why, right? Because I'm also trying to shift my but why to and why.
Yes.
Um, so
Improv,
I
right?
think and why.
Same.
So I think realizing, and sometimes it's us as the adults realizing that they need that before they move on and not getting in the power struggle in the first place. I think there's a lot more we have to do as adults that will support the behavior of students and or children instead of changing the behavior of students and children to support us as adults.
Mm.
So if we know they're going to get stuck, and I think teachers, parents, school psychologists, as educators, we know our kids' personalities. We know the students who need the explanation to move on. And if we provide that explanation ahead of time, we don't have to sit there in the rage to learn, right? Because we've provided that need that they have. So I really think of it as what do we as adults need to do to help support what our children and students need?
Yeah, I love that. It's like also leaning in, just like instead of fighting it, just lean into it and say, okay, this kid's gonna need to know the why. So I can front load the why. I'm like, we're gonna do this thing and here's why. And here's, like as a school psychologist example, like we're gonna, do counseling together and here's why is because we know that when kids are in brainstem, when they're in fight, flight, freeze, they're not in their frontal lobes, which is where thinking and reasoning occurs. And so we're going to figure out ways together to make sure that you're using your big, beautiful brain, right? So you can front load it or in the moment you can have a communication skill that we can teach, right? Like if they have to know why but there's no enough time to explain the whole history, like they don't need to know like why the clock works, they just need to know what time it is, right? Those moments. Can we give them a replacement behavior? What are some ideas you have for like, I know this kid needs to know why they're in this rage to learn. They're maybe a little dysregulated. I don't have time to explain the thing. What do we want these kids to do? Or what can adults do in those hot moments? I'm trying to think of a replacement behavior, like write down your question and we'll get back to you, or acknowledging we're gonna do this, but just not now. Like what kind of any practical tips under your tool belt?
I think both of those are great tips. I really like the tip of writing it on a post-it note and putting it for students, putting it on the desk, for kids at home, putting it on the fridge, somewhere where they know it still exists and you're not going to forget about it because you can see it, and they're not going to forget it because they can see it, and making it so that it's very tangible.
Yeah.
Um, because as adults, we forget things all the time. I mean, we forget to go back and answer the question, and students kind of keep track of that, and they know like, but you're not going to answer it later because we're going to go to recess and specials and lunch, or we're going to run this errand and that errand. And by the time we get home, we've forgotten about it. But I really like the just write it down, put it somewhere where everyone can see it, so there's a chance to revisit that later.
We do that in staff meetings as adults sometimes. We're going to put that idea in the parking lot. That requires a much longer conversation than our agenda today, right? So we can use that
Mhm.
strategy with students. And then it's validating, like, yeah, your question is important, and we're not going to lose sight of that. We're going to put it right here for the moment, but we're not going to forget about it. I love that. And I love the at home strategy of like putting it on your fridge or like creating a space in like a creativity corner, and you put like all of those like burning questions that we don't know the answers to, and we will revisit it together. This has been amazing. So at Coffee Break School Psychology, we like to have a little extra shot here of espresso, something kind of take with us, a practical tip or tool or a resource that parents and school psychologists and educators can go to if they want to learn more about gifted students, if they want to learn more about how to support mental health of students. I'm going to cue you up to share a resource that I think is quite fancy. Can you share this resource? We already pre-discussed why it's important for you to share this gorgeous research.
So as Rebecca knows, I'm an introvert. So thank you for queuing it up. There is a TED Talk that I did. It was super exciting to be able to have that opportunity. You can find it on the TED website if you search my name, or Becca can put it down with her resources on mental health and academic achievement. And it talks about gifted, but it also talks about lots of other reasons why supporting the mental health of students is essential for academic achievement. Some other resources I really like is the National Association for Gifted Children, supporting the emotional needs of the gifted, both great organizations that have lots of great resources for gifted students, parents, teachers, professionals all over the place. And there's some books I like. I like Smart but Scattered is a book about executive functioning, which I think is great for all students. Specifically, I like it for gifted students because we do typically see that the younger in the lower grades, gifted students don't struggle very much. And then in secondary, they start to have to use study skills, but they haven't developed them yet because everything came so easy when they were in elementary school. So those executive functioning strategies are really helpful. And then also, you reminded me of the book, but I forgot what it was. That was so great. Oh, Gifted and Distractible. That one. Yes.
Yes.
So those are my two. Those are some of my go-to resources.
And I'll drop all those resources below. But I want to thank you so much for coming to my extrovert club as an introvert. I'm sure this is going to be so helpful for our listeners out there. So cheers to you. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you next time on Coffee Break School Psychology.